Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Brian Hayden. He's a retired professor in the Department of Archaeology at Simon Fraser University, and he also holds a research position at the University of British Columbia. His research topics include cultural ecology and political ecology, hunting and gathering societies, transegalitarian societies, Aggrandizer strategies, especially feasting and secret societies, prehistory of religion and early ritual structures, and lithic technology. So, Dr. Hayden, thank you a lot for taking the time to come on the show. It's a pleasure to everyone.
That's my pleasure. Yeah.
Okay, great. So let me first ask you, because we're going to focus a lot today on things like feasting and also funerals, for example, and I mean things like aspects of sociality in hunter-gatherer societies, like, for example, if there's more or less gender equality and other things like that. So, but my first question would focus on the topic of ecology, because and since we're talking here in the domain of anthropology, would you like to tell us a little bit what ecology is for an anthropologist? Because I would guess that it's not exactly the same as the term is used in biology, for example, right?
Well, in fact, I think the use in anthropology is derived from the biological model. In biology, people study the ecology of animals, especially, and the main concern there is how animals get food and how they adapt, the different fitness that they have. And so a lot of the same concerns carried over into anthropology. So the cultural ecology model basically has tried to traditionally look at how people get food to eat, how they subsist. It's focused on their subsistence, and things like dominance hierarchies in access to food, or also how they might establish reserves for game to maintain the population of the game, or how they randomize their hunting patterns and things like that. And of course, the time and energy expended to get food to eat, etc. So that's traditional ecology. However, human beings differ substantially from that perspective in that human beings can produce surplus food that can be used for other purposes besides eating. And certainly other animals produce surplus food, like honeybees store honey, and squirrel away nuts for the winter, and a lot of times they put away more than they need, but they can only use as much as they can eat. And that is very different from human beings. Humans are unique in the biological world of animals, certainly, in that they can produce more food than they can actually consume, and they can use it to gain benefits of reproduction, or benefits of other kinds of things, political power. They can have more luxuries, things like that. And they especially use them in things like feasts. In feasts, you produce more food than you can eat, and you give it away in order to get political power, or other kinds of, or to gain another wife, or to gain whatever it is. So, basically when humans start competing over those things, they produce more and more food, and there can never be enough. And so basically it opens the sort of Pandora's box to producing food and using it for all sorts of other purposes, and then other sources of energy come in as well. And so I've sort of focused on a new kind of ecological paradigm, which I've called political ecology. which focuses on how those surplus productions are used for other purposes.
Mm-hmm. Right. So you mentioned things like cultural ecology and political ecology and some of the aspects that you study about them. And you also referred a little bit to the role that feasting plays in, for example, hunter-gatherer societies and other types of societies. So first, before we get more into that, in your work, you talk about trans-egalitarian societies and trans-egalitarian social dynamics. What does trans-egalitarian mean in that context?
Well, in the whole gamut of human societies, we go from one end, which is very egalitarian among simple hunters and gatherers that are nomadic, in which sharing food is very adaptive. In order for the whole group to get by, they really need to share food and everything else. And there's very little emphasis on the individual. If you want to, it's Marx's ideal form of primitive communism, in which everybody shares everything and responsibilities, et cetera, et cetera. And at the other extreme, we have groups that are very highly stratified. The Indian caste system, in which there are lots of inequalities and a lot of emphasis on private individuals, a lot of competition, etc. And so in between, there's a sort of transition zone where people have gotten away from sharing. There's private ownership and private use of resources, and a lot of competition involved using resources as well. In egalitarian sharing societies, there's very little competition involving economic goods or food. It's basically forbidden. And so when we start getting competition, when we start getting private ownership, and when we start getting inequalities in societies, that's what we call trans-egalitarian societies, because they've not become stratified class systems yet. They're in between. Okay.
Mm-hmm. And these trans-egalitarian societies, these has to do mainly with economics and the distribution of resources between all people that are part of that society, or does it also focus on specific inequalities, like, for example, inequality between men and women and other groups of people?
No, in terms of the definition, it's strictly focused on economics. Mm-hmm. Even in the egalitarian societies that I was talking about, and I should say economically egalitarian, even in those societies, there are inequalities in ritual life, in kinship, and in between men and women very often too. So it's a very good point. I should specify that we really are talking about economics and especially food when we're talking about inequalities and trans-egalitarian, the criteria for trans-egalitarian societies. But that spills over into food translates into wealth as well, because it is the basis for producing wealth in other forms.
Mm-hmm. And these trans-egalitarian societies, they can occur basically with any kind of food economy and any kind of society. Like, for example, when we think about hunter-gatherers, we tend to associate them with the most egalitarian human societies that ever existed. But in some of them, we can already find some economic inequalities, right?
Yeah, that's right. That's exactly right. There are what we call complex hunters and gatherers, which have these inequalities and which have developed uh, other aspects of what we usually think of as agricultural societies. You know, they have inequalities, social and economic inequalities. They have wealth differences. They have wealth, whereas simple hunters and gatherers, egalitarian hunters and gatherers do not. They sometimes even have slaves. You know, and they tend to be more permanent, more sedentary. They sometimes have large villages and even some things that we would usually consider monumental architecture. You know, the huge totem poles that weigh tons on the northwest coast here. But it's not, trans-egalitarian is not confined to just one type of subsistence. You get them with agricultural societies, with herding societies, pastoral nomads. So it's really just an economic and social way of looking at things rather than specific to one type of subsistence.
So let's get into some specific rituals that we can find across, I guess, all types of societies as well. You've already touched a little bit on feasting, but could you explain a little bit more what are the social functions of feasting, and perhaps in different societies? Because I would guess that feasting is not exactly the same in hunter-gatherers as it is in, for example, agricultural-based societies or state societies, right?
Well, you're right. I should preface our discussion about feasting saying that, you know, feasts in traditional societies, especially trans-egalitarian and chiefdom societies, are not what we're used to. They do not correspond to our dinner parties, for instance, or our Christmas meals. There is some relationship, but when we look at feasts in traditional societies, they imply a lot more. There's much more involved than just getting together and having a good meal together. Basically, the dynamics involved in traditional feasting involve almost contracts. If you invite me to your feast, then I am obligated to return that invitation and to invite you to my feast and to make it just as good, if not better, to provide the same kinds of food or food of equivalent worth or more. And very often there are gifts exchanged at these feasts as well to further complicate the debts that are involved, because these are contractual debts. And there are relationships. If I help you in my feast, then you have to help me. So it's building a support network. It's building a network of debts, which can become very complicated. The debts involved become so large that people have to resort to recording devices in some of the funeral feasts that we'll talk about in a minute. You know, there are books used today recording who has contributed what gifts to the feast. You know, and gifts in terms of animals, who has given how many pigs, who has given how many cattle, etc. And so the logic behind these traditional feasts is to create relationships, is to consolidate the relationships, and to build networks of debts. And so this is the key in my research, at least that I found in traditional societies, to understanding how inequalities become established, because people that have these support networks can create political factions within the communities. These factions serve many, many different functions, but it's people that are willing to produce surpluses in order to use in feasting, to give away in feasts, that create these networks, these factions. And these factions are very important in terms of buffering individuals against calamities, natural calamities, like a storm may come up and wipe out your entire field of grain, and so that you have no harvests for that year, and you need to borrow. Well, who do you borrow from? You borrow from people that are involved in your feasting network. Or there can be an epidemic like we're experiencing now, and many people in a family can be either ill or die and not be able to work. If you have these connections, these debts, you can call in the debts and survive much better than people that don't have them. But in addition to that, there are also political problems within communities. All of these traditional communities that I've worked in have factions, and they're constantly vying with each other, and there are constant disputes and things like that. So when these disputes come up, either because your dog has bitten or your dog has bitten my child or something like that, or your pig has gotten into my field and eaten a lot of the grain, or whether they're trumped up charges of sorcery, or there can be many, many issues or causes of conflicts in these communities. And when that happens, if you don't have connections, kinship connections or feasting connections, then you're open to being basically used and marginalized, and basically you're a target for social and political predators, is what I call them. People will take advantage of you, much like unscrupulous individuals in our own communities that are usually involved in gangs or illegal groups, criminals, etc. And they'll take advantage of you. And if you don't have any support, then you're SOL. But if you've got a powerful network of support, like other people that have wealth and have power and have backing from other people, then you're protected. And so these feasts are really critical for survival in these tribal and trans-egalitarian communities. I use tribal and trans-egalitarian somewhat interchangeably. So feasts become very important, and if you don't participate in a feasting network, then you quickly become marginalized. You become one of the disadvantaged in your community. It's very difficult for you to protect your own interests, and so you become poor and outcast, basically, and you can be a target for an attack of any sort. Feasts are important for all of those reasons. You have to realize that this is, I think, the major driving force behind getting people to produce more than they need for just subsistence. It's the driving force behind our surplus economy. They have to produce more than they need for feasting purposes. And in the communities that I'm familiar with, the cost of participating in these feasting networks can be quite high. In New Guinea, in Polynesia, in the Northwest Coast, typically people involved in feasting produce, well, let me say it this way. Typically 40 to 60% of everything that they produce gets used for feasting.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a huge amount. I mean, if we look at our tax rates, you know, that's a tax rate of the highest producers in our own economic systems. But it's you know, it's far beyond subsistence levels.
Mm-hmm. So please correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't it the case that probably this occurs more in agriculture societies and state societies because they have many more resources and people to mobilize to use those resources and do some feasts and things like that? But isn't it the case that feasts are also in some way used as a kind of a costly signal, or even perhaps we could call it costly waste to send a signal to other people, like for example neighboring states or neighboring tribes and things like that, that the person or the people that were able to hold that feast have resources in a way that they are able to waste them and still have access to resources, and so they also send the signal that they have a lot of power and influence in their respective society.
You touch on a number of very, very good points, and I see you've done your homework. Let me go back to the question about hunters and gatherers and agriculturalists first. As I mentioned previously, there are basically two kinds of hunters and gatherers: the simple egalitarian ones, and ones that are more complex and that have inequalities and who have feasting. And so we need to keep that distinction in mind because the simple egalitarian ones don't have the same kinds of feasts, and they may not have feasts at all, or depending on how we want to define feasts. But certainly they are different. We don't have the same kinds of obligations or the same magnitude of eating events, if we want to call them that. We don't have anything that's usually recognized as a feast and that doesn't have the same competitive kinds of aspects to it. When we get into transegalitarian societies, or hunters and gatherers, complex hunters and gatherers, like we have on the Northwest Coast here, you know, the famous potlatch of the Northwest Coast, excuse me, Indians. That gets pretty close to many egalitarian, many agricultural societies, many horticultural societies, and that quote I mentioned to you, 40 to 60%, that pertains to the Northwest Coast complex hunters and gatherers as well. So a lot of people don't appreciate just how complex hunting and gathering can get sometimes if the resource base is rich enough. And on the Northwest Coast here, we had slavery, we had huge potlatches. People had to save up for 5 or 10 years sometimes to hold these huge potlatches, but they did, and there was an enormous amount of wealth exchanged. So I wouldn't minimize the magnitude of the feasting and other strategies that get used. And I should have mentioned before that feasts are also often used in other strategies for using surplus, including marriages, paying for marriages. In order to get married, you have to pay enormous amounts for a bride, for instance, in many Transegalitarian societies. And expensive funerals, they serve many of the same purposes, which we can talk about later if you like. But also getting allies in war and things like that. All of these involve surpluses that have to be paid for. And so the paying for these arrangements is what's new. And when we start getting into agricultural societies, simple ones like horticultural societies, what we find is that there's not much difference between the complex hunting and gathering societies and the horticultural societies in terms of the types of feasts, the magnitude of the feasts. Sometimes, sometimes you can get into a little bit more. The main advantage of agriculture, not initially, but as the productivity of agriculture increased with larger types of harvestable plants and more efficient types of agriculture, you can grow bigger and better plants if you add irrigation and manuring and things like that. As that becomes more developed, and storage techniques as well, as they become refined, you can produce more surpluses and on a much larger scale. And when that happens, then you find that feasting gets bumped up in terms of intensity and magnitude, and the amount of wealth that gets produced increases. And so it becomes possible to produce much more surplus and use that to create larger networks, feasting networks, larger gift-giving networks that are also contractual. I give you a gift, you have to give me a gift of the same magnitude or more, and it becomes competitive to attain goals, marriage partners, political power, whatever it happens to be. Whoever can give the most gifts gets the most desirable mate and establishes the largest network. And that leads to more and more political complexity. We get chiefdoms, we get class systems, and ultimately we get our own society. So yes, that's agriculture eventually transforms our systems and bumps up the level of complexity to higher levels. Mm-hmm. And you are right entirely about the costly signaling. Feasting is used in part to signal people, to let people know that we are the most powerful, we produce the most surpluses, we have the most wives, the most desirable wives, we are the greatest, and so they hold feasts to make those societies great again, because in trans-egalitarian societies, one of the characteristics is that economic surpluses are ephemeral. They're not constant. And so you have to keep on renewing your feasting to renew the message that, to renew the debts, and also to renew the messages that we are great. And to, first of all, try to deflect any thoughts of military operations against you, any attacks, but also to attract traders and to attract desirable marriages among elites and to attract many other advantages. I mean, it's basically advertising, that's the way I view it at any rate. And so costly signaling certainly does play a role, but it's, I think, a subsidiary role to the debt structure that gets created as well. And it looks like we have to create a new event. Is that correct?
No.
It says new event in 30 minutes. Oh, in Washington, D.C. Anyway, sorry.
Yeah, no problem, no problem. Okay, so let's talk a little bit now about other types of rituals that people have in societies, in all types of societies. And if I'm not mistaken, probably these are more directly connected with religion, for example. So let's talk a little bit about ritual sanctuaries. In what types of societies do we find these sort of things, and what is the role that they play?
Ritual sanctuaries, well, we don't get much in terms of ritual sanctuaries among simple egalitarian hunters and gatherers. We get sacred sites, and people go to those sites, and I guess they could be considered as sanctuaries, but they're not usually built. They're usually natural features in the environment. I would call them shrines, perhaps, but they're not part of the built environment, which is what comes to mind when I think of sanctuaries or ritual structures. It's only when people start settling down and have a little bit of surplus to work with that we start getting these specialized sanctuaries, and they start occurring with complex hunting and gathering societies. Like in the Northwest Coast here, there was a whaling sanctuary, a whaling shrine, but it was a built construction. And I would argue that the earliest sanctuaries are in the Upper Paleolithic of Europe, going back between 15 and 35,000 years ago. The painted caves, which were modified inside in terms of the paintings, but sometimes also in terms of creating modeled images of animals modeled out of clay, or sometimes sculpted into the rock faces. And some of the sculptures would have taken weeks to have done. I mean, they're life-size, and they're almost three-dimensional, and they're pretty remarkable. So when we start getting a large amount of effort being invested in these ritual sites, I think that's what we could call a sanctuary. And after that, in the Neolithic, we start getting built structures. In the Neolithic of the Near East in particular, the pre-pottery Neolithic, one of the most famous now is Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, which has some amazing, just amazing semi-subterranean constructions. But in all of these cases, and they've got sculpted pillars, and usually you would associate them with megalithic constructions, but no, they seem to have been built by hunting and gathering groups as well, even though they're called Neolithic, and they date to about 12,000 years ago. And in the Natufian, we also get structures. At any rate, what's characteristic of all of these structures is that they're not for everybody. They're not like our churches or temples or synagogues. They're not these large buildings that will house the entire community. No, basically they're fairly small structures that are really only suitable for use by a limited number of people, and I would say an exclusive number of people. And very often in the case of the Upper Paleolithic caves or the early structures like at Göbekli Tepe, they're very lavishly decorated. These, what I would argue is that you really need some way to underwrite the construction and the decoration of these sanctuaries. And so that implies wealth. That implies some sort of economic inequalities, and it's the I would argue it's the people with the most wealth that are constructing these and that are the most powerful in the communities, and that are underwriting their construction. And we also get evidence of feasting involved with these structures as well, which indicates another small network. And in some of these cases, and specifically in a site called Jurf El Ahmar in northern Syria, we get good indications of human sacrifices and cannibalism. And we also get indications that certainly in the painted caves in France and Spain, we get in the Iberian Peninsula, we get indications that there were children involved as well. And in the research that I've done with a student of mine, Deanne Owens, we found that basically the context in which children are involved in ritual activities like this among complex hunting and gathering groups are called ritual secret societies. And these secret societies claim to have, supernatural powers, which they claim to use for the benefit of the community, and also they use to terrorize the community sometimes, a lot of times, to demonstrate what will happen if these supernatural powers are not controlled. So that on the Northwest Coast here we have, one of the main societies was the Cannibal Society. And they would do demonstrations of people that are supposedly possessed by cannibal spirits, and who would run riot through the villages and in the ceremonies and go around biting people. And so that basically the early observers called this terrorizing the community, the early terrorists, if you like. And then the members of the secret society would come out and demonstrate their supernatural powers by calming these individuals and exorcising the cannibal spirits so that they return back to a normal civilized state and were no longer a danger to the community. So they manufacture these threats, these supernatural threats, and then they control the manufactured threats and show their great powers. And they also do a lot of other demonstrations of supernatural powers. They put their hands in boiling water. They walk on fire. They put live coals in their mouths and spew out sparks. So they kill people and then bring them back to life. They have feathers that dance by themselves. They do all sorts of magical kinds of tricks to demonstrate their supernatural powers in order to convince people. And basically they constitute the elites of these transegalitarian societies. And it's another network that basically tries to control society. But they have the advantage that they include many different kin groups, or the leaders of many different kin groups, and they can spread to other communities as well, so that they have the same cannibal society in many communities, and they bring them in for the big demonstrations of power and big feasts and things like that. But they're ways of controlling and bringing in wealth, because they tell the community that in order to protect the community has to support their feasts, and so they have to contribute food, and they also have very high initiation costs, fabulously high initiation costs in some cases, which all goes to the leaders of these secret societies, and so these are fairly widely distributed ethnographically among transegalitarian societies. You don't get them with simple hunters and gatherers. We only get them when we get wealth being generated and inequalities. And it seems to me that it's another strategy, like marriage, like feasts, to obtain self-interest and to promote one's self-interest and get political power within communities and even between communities. Mm-hmm. So I think that's what the initial sanctuaries are. These initial sanctuaries very often occur on the outskirts of communities, sometimes within communities as well, but they always have a secret area for getting together away from the community or semi-subterranean within the community. Like Dürfel Lathmar, the ritual structures are dug into the ground, so they're clandestine. Nobody can see in. Göbekli is the same thing. The secret societies in the southwest of the United States and the kivas, those are dug into the ground as well. The sanctuaries in Upper Paleolithic France, they're in caves, that nobody else can get into unless they're admitted. Their activities are secreted away. They're secret. Some of them are secret. Some of them are public demonstrations as well. So it's not the existence of the societies that's secret or the members. It's it's the secret knowledge that they have for controlling these supposed supernatural forces. Mm-hmm. I don't know.
I understand. So at the beginning, sorry?
That's a long diatribe on secret societies, but it's my current passion. So
yeah, I understand. No problem. You can talk for as long as you want. So
yeah, so I've got one more point to make, and that is that's what I think these sanctuaries were all about, that we find archaeologically dating back 10, 12 or more thousand years ago. And I have to add that traditionally, most archaeologists see these as being created in order to increase social solidarity because there are too many disputes in the community, and this is a way to bring everybody together and make them all feel good and neighborly and reduce the social tensions. But no, that's not what I think they were about at all. I think these original structures were not communitarian. They were not for social solidarity. In fact, they were meant to reinforce the social divisions between the initiated and the non-initiated, the poor typically, because you have to be rich in order to join these, just like golf clubs and things like that. And basically, there was one incredible quote from somebody here on the Northwest Coast who said that the poor would always start crying when they heard that there was going to be a big ceremony by the secret society, because they knew that somebody of the poor faction in the community was going to die, that people would be murdered or sacrificed as part of this, because people would be terrorized in many of these rituals. And sometimes human sacrifice was a way of terrorizing people. And so in a lot of these secret societies, we do get, one way or another, people being terrorized or sacrificed or cannibalized in some cases. So that, belief in the supernatural was not nearly sufficient to convince everybody. There were always doubters, and so they resorted to terrorizing them instead. And that is not the way to build community solidarity. It's not the way to bring everybody in a community together, at least not voluntarily. And so,
yeah, that's a good point. And what about funerals? Why are funerals so socially relevant?
Well, when we get into societies with inequalities, I would argue it's yet another strategy besides feasts and marriages and secret societies. It's yet another major way that some individuals can promote their networks, and also create inequalities. That's done in two ways. I should preface this by saying that when we're in these trans-egalitarian societies, typically they maintain a charade of equality. That is, the exercise of power is still very conditional. If you piss off too many people, they will stop cooperating with you, and they'll start throwing accusations of sorcery against you. They'll start undermining your network, and once that starts happening, you lose your ability to control things, your power base, and so you have to at least give lip service to equality in the community. And that's what I found over and over. You ask people, are there any inequalities in this community? Any people that have more power or that are richer than others? People say, oh, no, everybody's equal. But then you go on and you look at the households. You do inventories like we did. How many cattle do you own? Well, I don't own any. How many feasts do you go to? Well, I don't go to any feasts. How many pigs do you have? Well, I have one pig, and then you go to another household. Well, how many cattle do you have? Well, I've got 72. And how many pigs do you have? Well, I've got 45. And, you look at their houses. One's poor, one's rich. So they're inequalities, they're incontrovertible inequalities. And you see that in the political system as well, and how it operates. It's these feasting factions that get to dominate the political factions through their elders and people like that. So, but you have to maintain this facade of equality, of not exploiting other people. And so you can't be too overt in your exercise of power. You can't be too overt in your display of richness. Everybody knows it exists, but you can't throw it in their face, okay? Because then you get resistance, you get, it just undermines your whole power base. And so typically one of the few ways, people try to find ways of displaying things nevertheless. And one of the ways that's least criticable, that's not a word, but can be least criticized, is honoring somebody that's died. How do you criticize somebody for saying, for trying to honor their father or their mother who's passed away, and who's, you just want to do good for them. It's not for you, it's for them. Okay, and so you put on as large a display of honor as you can, and people have a very hard time criticizing that. Doing good ritual things is another thing they have a hard time criticizing. So you can hide behind these kinds of charades, these kinds of pretexts for putting on big displays. And that's typically what we find people doing in trans-egalitarian societies. They have these huge displays for funerals, and it becomes a competitive kind of arena for displaying your success. You have the biggest funeral feast. You kill the most animals. You display all of the fine wares that you may have for the funeral, whether it's fine china, porcelain wares, silver spoons, whatever it happens to be. Put all of that out in honor of the dead. But you also make the dead powerful. And so it's the dead who are conferring, because you've honored them so much, you've given them more power in the spiritual realm, and they in turn return that to you in terms of good harvests, in terms of surpluses, in terms of, you know, your ability to acquire wealth or acquire ritual power, ritual practices. So it's not you, it's them. It's them that's doing this. You're not responsible. You know, you've done your ritual duties, and they, in gratitude, they are conferring all these blessings and benefits on you. And so it's a way of hiding what's going on. But you're also using these funerals to establish the power of the ancestors. And as you as the head of a household has a special relationship to them. And so that enables you to exert more power over people in your lineage, people that, you know, your descendants. If they don't do what you say they have to do for the ancestors, of course, it's always for them, then that could create real problems. And so, you know, why did your son fall sick? Well, it's because you didn't contribute as much as you should have to the ancestor feast that I organize. Or it's because you didn't provide enough paraphernalia, rich paraphernalia, for the rituals. Or why did you have that accident? Well, it's because you didn't do what I told you to do ritually for your ancestor, for our ancestor. Okay, so it provides a means, and I wrote an article on this some years ago, and I forgot to mention that aspect of this, why people try to make the dead ancestor more and more powerful so they can put themselves in positions of power. So because these funeral feasts get so large, they attract more and more people, and they become events where people connect. They re-establish the networks, sometimes far-flung in other communities, so that you have family members that live, you know, your uncle lives 2 or 3 hours away in travel. Well, you don't see him that often, but if there's a funeral, yes, he reconnects. And that becomes an important connection. Or a feasting partner is invited, or a secret society member. You know, you don't see them except for very special occasions. And funerals of important members are one of those. So they also establish these networks, and they become important events for giving gifts, which become debts. As I mentioned before, in the Torajan highlands where I worked in Indonesia, people had books and they were writing down who gave which animal, how big the animal was, and for the funeral feast. And some of these become enormous events. It takes 10 years to prepare for them. But they involve hundreds of animals being sacrificed, pigs and cattle. People come from all over. They have to build special structures to house the people that are torn down after the funeral. It's just incredible. It's some of the most lavish funeral events I've ever seen anywhere. So for all these reasons, in order to show off, display success, costly signaling if you like, but establishing debts as well, in order to display, create debts, to extend and reestablish the networks, the support networks, in order to put the ancestors in special powerful places that you can justify your inequalities and wealth for, and control other people in the lineage. For all of these reasons, funerals become very important in Transegalitarian and chiefdom societies as well. We had still use some of those things to reestablish our networks, kinship networks usually, but friendship networks, in in traditional communities in our own society too, but much more important in trans-egalitarian ones, where these networks are essential for survival.
Yeah, sure. So let me ask you now, we've been touching on this topic throughout the interview a little bit here and there, but what would you say were some of the most important and visible consequences of the adoption of agriculture and of the creation of agriculture-based societies? I mean, when you look to hunter-gatherers and probably, I guess, also horticulturalists and pastoralists to some extent, and compare them to how society is structured and organized and things like that in agriculture-based societies, what would you say are the biggest differences?
Well, as I alluded to before, agriculture allows you eventually, and in good environments, and with the appropriate storage technology and things like that, to produce more and more surpluses, which can be used to create more and more wealth and to create larger networks, and to increase and to create more political complexity, which bumps things up. I mean, you get larger populations as well, so that you can create irrigation systems with enough labor to increase production even further. And so you get this upward spiral, and you can start bringing in, with these technological innovations, more different means of creating energy, creating goods and surpluses, so that you get, harnessing of wind, technological advances, wind and fire, and eventually steam and other kinds of machines. So all of this is part of this competitive striving to increase production, to increase debts, to increase the amount of goods that can be produced to put into these networks, and eventually, we get more and more complex kinds of political organizations, chiefdoms, and then eventually leading into states and class systems. So, it's a straight and narrow road from the initiation of feasting and complex hunting and gathering societies producing surpluses. I mean, once that starts, the ball is rolling, the juggernaut is going, and you eventually end up with the Industrial Revolution in our type of society, and national states, before that, empires, going back to the Romans, the Chinese empires, and many other empires. But though all those were limited by technology, you can transport technology, storage technology, communications technology. So you hit the certain limit and you can't go any higher with the given technology. It's only with the Industrial Revolution that we've really bumped things up yet again and found even more sources of energy to use in this traditional ritual of competition and networking and debt creation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so let me just ask you one last question, and we will go back now to the very beginning of our conversation when we talked about cultural and political ecology, and you defined ecology from an anthropological perspective. I would like to ask you before we finish, so you were saying that when you talked about those kinds of ecology, you were and for example, how it applied to social inequality, that you were referring mostly to economic inequality. But now I wanted to ask you, what are some of the most important aspects of ecology? And now I'm referring not only to, let's say, biological ecology, but also to the other types of ecology you mentioned that influence the status of women in hunter-gatherer societies.
Yeah, well, in fact, what we find in hunting, and again, we're going back to the simple egalitarian hunting and gathering societies, right? We're not talking about complex
Sure.
hunters and gatherers, because then things become more complicated. You have lower and upper classes, and women's status changes if you're talking about lower versus upper class. But in the simple egalitarian hunters and gatherers, we did a study a number of years ago looking at the variation within this, because we get a lot of variation. We get some hunting and gathering societies where women's status is fairly equal to men's status. So there's relative equality between the sexes. And we get other hunters and gatherers where women's status is very inferior to that of men. And some people thought that, well, maybe it has to do with how much food women produce in the society, the contribution of women's work. But that didn't seem to be the case when we started looking into it. I and a number of other students, it was sort of a group project. So we looked at some of the environmental factors that might be involved, we thought might be involved. And what we found is that in ecological situations where there was a lot of stress and repeated stress, marginal environments like desert environments where you get large fluctuations and things like that, that it becomes very important under those circumstances to maintain low population levels. And that women's status was very low in those kinds of stressed environments. And so we thought, whereas the women's status tended to be higher where resources were more stable and a little bit more abundant. And so what we think is going on is that there's sort of an enforced population control in the unstable environments. And so that one way of, in hunting and gathering societies, we have a situation where infanticide is very accepted. And so if women can't afford to maintain their children, that's the main reason for killing off newborn infants. Because women just feel that they can't do it. It's just too much work, and they can't get enough food. So it's rather than have an infant that's going to be suffering and the mother is going to be suffering as well, they just kill off an infant. And so that's an accepted practice. And so what we think is that in order to put more pressure on women to limit the number of children that they have, they put them in a subservient position, and they're forced to do a lot more of the drudge work, a lot more of the work, so that they don't have time to raise as many children. And in fact, in these societies where women's status is low, once they get beyond the childbearing age, once they get beyond menopause, the work that they're forced to do sort of evaporates. They're not required to do as much work anymore. And so this is, I think, telltale sign of why their status is so low. And when you look at women's status in other domains besides just food production, for instance, in the ritual status, there's no relationship there between the environment, the environmental stresses, and women's status. So that varies independently. So yeah, it seems like there is a very strong relationship between women's status and some of these concerns about maintaining low population levels so that you don't overexploit the food resources that you have available. So, and it's yeah, that's the main overriding concern is food. If there's not enough food, if you kill off too many kangaroos, or you harvest too many yams, then there's not going to be enough in the future. It's a lesson that we haven't quite learned ourselves in our own society. We keep on over-harvesting fish and killing off bison and beaver and everything else way beyond the limit. It's all for, once we start competing for food, either for sale or to get as much food as possible, or to sell as many hides, buffalo hides as possible, or beaver hides as possible. Once we start competing for food, that's a death knell for the animal population or the food base that we have to rely on, and we just overexploit it, and then we don't have enough. So.
Yeah, that's another type of problem of modern societies. I guess that is even more so in modern societies because we have much better technological apparatuses, let's say, or something like that. So, Dr. Hayden, let's end on that note. But before we go, would you like to mention some places on the internet or other types of sources where people can get in touch with your work the easiest?
Well, if you just Google me on the internet, I've got a list of publications. It's maybe not updated over the last year, but sort of all the traditional work on feasting and funerals and women's status among hunters and gatherers and things like that are there. The most recent book, I'm not sure if that's up on the list of publications or not, but the most recent book on secret societies is called The Power of Ritual in Prehistory. And there are a few, I need to update things a bit more.
So I will be leaving links to all of that in the description box of the interview so that people can go and check it out. It's a very interesting work as we talked here about it. So Dr. Hayden, thank you again a lot for taking the time to come on the show, and it was a real pleasure to talk to you.
Well, thank you for inviting me, and it's been a pleasure for me as well. And it's been quite a rich and rewarding research career and doing some of the work on feasting and ritual and things like that. So thanks very much.
Hello everybody, thank you for watching this interview until the end. I have a lot of new patrons now, so I'm trying to get that 100 as soon as it's possible, to try to get also at 800 euros of monthly support. So let's see if we can get there. I've been putting out regular interviews with academics and intellectuals from a variety of fields. And to keep the channel sustainable, I would like to ask you to visit my Patreon page and to consider making a pledge there, any amount you feel comfortable with. And otherwise, you can also make a one-time donation on PayPal, or also you can monthly subscribe on PayPal. I have all the links in the description box of the interview. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like, and hit the subscription button. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and supporters: Karin Litske, Anne Blanchett, Perga Larsen, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunda, Ricardo Vladimiro, Craig Healy, Adam Castle, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wiesel, David Diaz, Anian Kata, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollesy, Enric Alenius, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Voss, Bo Weingard, Rebecca Newberger Goldstein, Dan Demetriou, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Arthur Coe, Marco Neves, Max Bailby, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Thomas Trumbull, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Columbus, Jorge Spinhe, Phil Kavanagh, Corey Clark, Mark Blythe, Roberto Inguanzo, Michael Stormer, Eric Neumann, Samuel Andreev, Tiago Nunes, Bernard Hugney, Alexander Dan Bauer, Omari Hickson, Felicia Stevens, Fergal Cusson e Evan Bodrenko, Al Herzog. My producers is Arwebe, Rosie, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Dr. Ian Gilligan, Sergio Quadriano, Luis Caetano, and Matthew Lavender, and my executive producer, Michel Rugieski. Thank you for all.